Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Our program will begin in just a moment. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Our program will begin in just a moment. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Our program will begin in just a moment. Good day. Welcome to Advocacy Anywhere, powered by AJC. Advocacy Anywhere is AJC's digital platform that enables you to engage with AJC's global expertise, content, and advocacy from wherever you are. Today's program is brought to you in partnership with Jewish Insider. You can sign up for Jewish Insider's daily kickoff by visiting www.jewishinsider.com. Today, we will be discussing the collapse of the political center and what it means for American Jews. We are delighted to be joined by Batya Ungar-Sargon, opinion editor at The Forward, and Seth Mandel, executive editor of Washington Examiner magazine. Our conversation will be moderated by AJC's Global Director of Young Leadership, Seffi Kogan. After we hear from our guests, we'll take your questions. You may email your questions to questions, that's questions plural, at ajc.org, or use the Q&A feature in Zoom. Seffi, you and our esteemed panelists have the floor.
Thank you, Ali. And in the interest of getting through as many questions as possible and hearing from our speakers as much as possible, I will dive right in. Yesterday, AJC's National Leadership Council received an exclusive briefing from Dr. Len Schleifer, the CEO of Regeneron Pharmaceuticals. And toward the end of the call, he made the point, I hope I'm not misrepresenting you here, Len, he made the point that part of why America hasn't been a world leader in responding to the coronavirus crisis, far from it, is because our political polarization has had almost a paralyzing effect on the ability of our government to address the primary and secondary issues coming from the pandemic. Put differently, in a certain sense, our political divide is literally making us sick. So just to lay some groundwork, I want to start by asking each of you, how did we get here? How is it that the country that dominated the last century now seems at times like it could tear itself apart? Batya, let's begin with you.
So I want to start by pushing back a little bit on this concept of polarization. First of all, thank you so much for having me. It's really an honor to be here. It's so great to be with Seth, somebody I admire so much, and with you, Seffi, as well. And thank you to AJC for having us. I am a bit of a polarization skeptic. And what I mean by that is I think that when you look around at our nation more generally, this polarization effect that is so clear to us on Twitter, that is so clear in Congress and in the Senate and so clear in the media actually really evaporates as soon as you get out of these sort of centers of chattering class and political classes. So, which is just to say that the tragedy of the polarization in our nation's elites is so much greater because it truly is leaving, our nation behind in the dust. We are actually much less polarized as a nation than we have ever been in our history. We don't, all of the sort of major culture wars of the 80s and 90s are over. The left actually won so many of these on questions of diversity and LGBTQ rights. Polling shows that as a nation, we have never been more united than we are over the major issues that this nation was founded on. And so it's deeply tragic to see then that in the media and in the political classes, we are at each other's throats, really failing to represent the people that we are supposed to be representing.
Seth, do you kind of agree with that formulation? Do you want to take a stab at the original question, or you also kind of disagree with my premise here?
Yeah, well, I would say, I mean, first of all, again, also thank you for having us. This is a very big honor for Batya, and for me as well. No, I think that Batya is basically right. I think the problem is that there's a perception of partisanship, but that perception of partisanship actually has a real effect on what's happening and what goes on and the formation of policy and things like that. If you just look at the coronavirus stuff, since the question was based on the coronavirus stuff, if you just look at that, you see there have been polls that show, there was a piece from Nate Silver at 538 the other day that, or recently, that made the point that Republicans and Democrats are not actually divided. We're not actually so divided on following lockdown protocol. They were only divided on when pollsters asked them, do you like this or not like this, basically, right? I mean, like, we don't like being locked down, but they may talk more, Republicans may talk more about infringements on liberty, but they follow the rules and grumble about having to follow the rules rather than civil disobedience. They're wearing masks and things like that. And so where that comes from is that you have leaders in alternative media, in party affiliated or party associated media that make a lot of noise. That noise then gets picked up by the rest of us in the mainstream media, and we sort of broadcast it out, and it makes it look and sound like there's a real divide here. But in reality, on the important thing, which is compliance, that divide wasn't really there. It was just an argument we were having in public. But that's what a democracy is. We were having the argument in public, and the lockdown side was the restrictions were winning the argument, and both sides more or less complied with the ramifications of that. So in some ways, I do really think it's healthier than it looks, but I worry that if we're formulating policy and we're having these national conversations based on the perception of division, then the reality matters less than it should. So we need to somehow find a way to have the leaders in Congress, in media, in those who set the national debate reflect the same level of division or lack thereof as the general public.
Mm-hmm. We're talking about the vanishing center, whether it's actually vanishing kind of out in the districts, or it's only vanishing maybe in the halls of Congress. To Seth's last point, right? Like, that might matter more, or still matter, even if the folks back home kind of still get along. But if we're talking about the vanishing center, the center makes me think of consensus issues. Fighting anti-Semitism and supporting Israel both used to be consensus issues, and I think that in some ways they're both disappearing. Maybe the consensus support for Israel is disappearing a little more obviously than the consensus support for fighting anti-Semitism, but I think you would both agree that people are trying to instrumentalize the fight against anti-Semitism in a way that's really unhelpful. So Seth, we'll start with you. Why are consensus issues like this disappearing? And let me add, what can we Jews do looking outward to try to keep others from using our issues as political footballs? And by the way, what do we need to do looking inward to prevent that from happening within our own camp?
So I think the issue that I always return to as something that looks better than the American Jewish community's response by comparison is what happened with Jeremy Corbyn in the UK. And on the eve of the election, there was a poll that 87% of British Jews considered him anti-Semitic. And I just remember thinking that's as close as a consensus as I can ever remember. I mean, I think like the reverse was when maybe Ehud Olmert had like a 5% approval rating or something, and you had 95% of Israelis agreeing. It wasn't a very happy moment, but you had not. So anytime you have a country's Jews almost at 90% agreeing on something, that's unity. That's a form of achdus, and it also means that the political ramifications were not what was important. I had people telling me, hey, look, I'm a lifelong labor member. I'm not leaving the party, but I'm canvassing for bars. I'm going to go door to door and tell people, vote for the Tories. I've never voted for a Tory, but I'm going to be out there. And so the community was able to basically hit pause. T, as my kid says, when they're running around the yard, right, and they're about to get caught in tag or something. The community was basically able to say, all right, set that aside. Let's take care of this. and then we'll go back to the way we were. We don't have the same sense of an American Jewish community in America. We have much more of an Americanized version of that. And America itself, you see this in everything, is, well, first of all, I think we're a bit more tribal than we used to be as a political, not we as a tribe, but we as America as a political, as a polity, but also that you have America has this history of every political movement and every religion having countless what you might call breakaway minions. So and splinter groups and whatever, people just, the centralization of authority is not really a thing here. Mm-hmm. We don't have a chief rabbi. And so we don't really have a way to speak with one voice. And it's just a very Americanized version. That there are good aspects of that. There are bad aspects of that. The bad aspects include a marked inability to come together in a time of crisis and just put everything aside, put political considerations aside, put cultural considerations aside, put everything aside and say, all right, let's get together and fix this. And, and then we'll get back to arguing with each other and fighting and stuff like that. And that takes a prioritization. That takes an ability to say, this is up here in terms of importance. And, what we were arguing about yesterday is here. So this is what we're going to do today. We're all going to come together, and then we'll get back to here, and we'll all be much more comfortable arguing, over, what exactly that slime is in the gefilte fish jar, and whether you should just make your own homemade loaf and avoid it altogether.
So I mean, just to redirect here as we come to Batya for an answer to the question. We've found in our own polling at AJC that something north of 80% of American Jews, 83%, 85%, something like that, of American Jews say when queried about certain anti-Zionist phrases, that those things are anti-Semitic. So if you say, if you ask American Jews, do you believe that Israel has no right to exist as a Jewish state? A vast number of them, on par with the number of Jewish Britons who Seth was talking about, who opposed Jeremy Corbyn. A vast number of them say, no, that's anti-Semitic. So if American Jews actually do kind of, loud voices aside, actually do believe that support for Israel is a consensus issue, what are some practical steps that American Jews could or should be taking to try to throw some elbows and safeguard those consensus issues?
So I hate to answer a question with a question, but what exactly is the evidence that support for Israel is no longer a consensus issue in American politics? I mean, I don't see that. Are you? Actually, yeah, do you want to tell me what you're referring to specifically? Because to me, again, it seems like one of these sort of invented polarization issues that, I mean, Americans by and large are still extremely Zionist. The members of the squad who are not are very unpopular, actually. And so what specifically are you referring to before I sort of, again, dispute the premise?
So I'll give you an example. Last week, we had a program specifically geared toward college students, where we featured the president of the National College Republicans and the president of the National College Dems. And the talking point that we heard over and over again from the president of the College Republicans was, if you support Israel, the Republican Party is the place to be, and he lists all kind of reasons why he believes that President Trump is the best president for Israel. Now, someone could say that's simply a bad faith argument, but whether you think it's a bad faith argument just intending to pull people over to the Republican side, or you think that he's correct and actually the Democratic Party is bad for Israel, either way, Israel is being instrumentalized as an issue. And I think that when an issue is being similarly, right, anti-Semitism in that vein is still a consensus issue, right? Because everyone agrees that anti-Semitism is bad. But if the way that people are saying anti-Semitism is bad is you're pointing out the other guys and you're saying, look at those anti-Semites, aren't they so bad? Then I think it's really no longer a consensus issue.
Okay, well, so I would disagree with that. I would say, yes, Israel is being instrumentalized, but very poorly, right? It has failed to become a major issue. During the Democratic primaries, despite every newspaper telling us that it was going to be, and every leftist and every right-wing person telling us 2020 is going to be about Israel. 2020 is not going to be about Israel. And why isn't going to be about Israel? Because there's huge consensus. Americans like Israel. You know, there's really like nothing going on there. So yes, people are trying to instrumentalize it, but they're doing a very bad job of it. On anti-Semitism, people are trying to instrumentalize it. They're doing a much better job of it, although I would argue it's because it's such a clear cut, right versus wrong issue, that what you end up having is 50% of the the Democrats are very good at pointing it out when Republicans say and do anti-Semitic things. Republicans are very good at pointing out when Democrats say and do anti-Semitic things. But what you end up with is, 100% of the time, anti-Semitic stuff is getting called out. Now, of course, it would be better if everybody policed it on their own side. It would be more effective. But to argue that Americans are just okay with anti-Semitism, I think is totally false. Now, I do think that there is a form of anti-Semitism that everybody, and especially liberal Jews, are completely okay with, and that's anti-Semitic attacks against the Orthodox. It is shameful, and liberal Jews are the worst. There's no real difference there. We struggle to call it out, to stand up for Orthodox Jews, to see them as one of ours. The ADL numbers came out today. There were 61 physical assaults. Most of those were against Orthodox Jews in 2019. It's shocking and horrifying. So we should do better on that front. But to say that these are issues that are no longer consensus, I kind of see the opposite. Like, they wouldn't be the anti-Semitism wouldn't be so easy to hurl as an accusation against your opponents if Americans truly didn't care about it. Americans care a lot about anti-Semitism. So I would just push back on that slippage that you're creating between, consensus and then instrumentalization.
Mm-hmm. Okay, we can move away from this first set of issues. I wanted to get a little bit into the role of journalism in trying to foster more of a sense of consensus and American mutual understanding. You're both editors of publications, which rightly or wrongly are associated with a certain political viewpoint. And each of you try to feature voices outside of your own political camp. As editors, what is your responsibility to give your readers what they want versus kind of making them take their medicine and hear dissenting views? And Batya, maybe we'll stick with you.
So I can tell you my philosophy of running an opinion section. I'm the opinion editor at The Forward. And I have a philosophy, and it goes like this. I believe that there are sort of three main mandates to running an opinion section, and each one is sort of amped up in the age of Trump. So the first is to raise up the voices of the people currently disenfranchised by the power structures, people who you don't hear from. So in our case, that's, because our audience is, largely liberal. So that means conservative Jews, Republican Jews, people who voted for Trump, Orthodox Jews. It also means Black Jews. It means Muslims. It means Palestinians. It means settlers. We don't hear from them a lot. It just really raising up the voices of people who you don't hear from a lot, and particularly people who, I guess settlers don't really fall into this, but who have been disenfranchised in some way, who are sort of not empowered to speak usually in the means that we are used to hearing people. You don't turn on MSNBC and see them. The second mandate, I believe, is to reflect the full breadth of legitimate opinion relevant to our community. The full breadth, but that is where the sort of proportion comes in, right? So 70% of American Jews are Democrats. Does that mean 70% of my op-eds are going to be on the left or liberal leaning or Democrat. I mean, I do strive to that. I strive to accurately reflect the community in the pages. And then the third mandate is, you know, to honestly challenge myself, the editorial point of view, and my readers in good faith. And that's really the hardest thing, is getting a piece that the reader will interpret as challenging them in good faith. So those are the sort of the three building blocks. And if you read our you know, the opinion section at the forward, you'll see each piece falls into one, if not two, if not all three of these categories.
Mm-hmm. And Seth, what about your work at the Examiner?
Yeah, I think one thing you have to understand is that different publications have different brands and different, the editorial side, we'll see that as what we would call that a mission. And the general public would probably call it a brand. And the confusion of the two is something that often gets in the way of what we're trying to do. So people, when I was opinion editor at the New York Post before this, and I would see people on Twitter share these things like critical, let's say, you know, something, they'd share something critical of Trump in the New York Post, and they'd go, you know, even the New York Post, or, you know, when you've lost the New York Post or something, it's like, if the New York Post wanted a Trumpist editorial section, they wouldn't have hired me to, you know, run it. And we sort of get the same, we make the same jokes at the Examiner, you know, where people, there's a problem in the readership of journalism, I think, across the board, in that there's a lack of context, that people don't really like context, and they don't really like injecting it into things. And so people will take one article and say, oh, that this is the so and whatever publication says this, you know, stuff like that. And you can make an argument. I could go through Batya's newspaper and build a case that it is a right-wing publication. It's obviously not a right-wing publication, but if I wanted to, I could do that. You know, and that's why you also have people who are on the conservative side who sometimes complain that, you know, we have moved left at the Examiner because you have a high-profile story that everybody shares, and it tends to be this one that is a defining issue for a lot of readers. And so they don't care that there's these three other stories on the homepage that say something else. What they care about is like this huge story we're all looking at, Russia collusion, right? I don't care where the Examiner comes down on the carried interest loophole. I don't care where the Examiner, you know, comes down on sin taxes. I care much more about where it comes down, or what it thinks of the Russia collusion stuff or the Ukraine stuff, or what, right? So, you know, we tend to do this one big issue thing, and everything else just sort of floats away, and you end up having a lack of context. And one thing that editors do, Batya and myself both try to do, as well as the editors of the other publications that everybody out there is reading, is cover all of the issues relevant, right, to the audience, and things that should be relevant, and get them the information they want to know. But when you go on the internet, you see the cherry picking, and that, you know, there's like, I don't know, like 5% of America is on Twitter or something, but 99.99% of those are journalists and politicians. So so the narrative gets set with these ridiculous fights that go on Twitter, and the rest of the country has no idea that it's even happening. But it also is, you know, you guys, I think everybody notices that happens with politics. And I think what Batya and I notice is that it happens with the reading of our publications. It happens with the media itself, where that sort of cherry picking goes on a place like Twitter or whatever, a place that is not representative of the public at large. That's okay, except when it's treated as representative of the public at large, and it's a place where these narratives sort of get set. So I think that a main challenge for us is that it's very easy to get caught up in trying to prove you're not what they say you are, you know? And so, and that can be a real challenge when people say like, oh, the Washington Examiner, well, look, it's turning into a Trumpist publication or whatever. And then there's like this instinct to say, no, it's not. Look at this, look at this, look at this. And then you find yourself defending your own coverage by making yourself the story and damaging your own publication's reputation by making it seem like you are trying to get a point across, or that people should look at certain articles or certain things you do and draw wide conclusions from them, because now you're making that argument. And so I think one of the big obstacles for us is just to not get caught up in all that. And remember, Batya and I both have a lot of readers. Thank God. May it continue. And so there's a lot of people reading, and though you have to remember to keep those people in mind, that you are communicating directly with them. You are not writing for, and you are not editing for your peers and your friends on Twitter.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. We're going to go to audience Q&A in just a moment, and I'll just remind our hundreds of people watching along with us on Zoom, and doubtless many, many more on our Facebook live stream. I'll remind you all that you can submit your questions to questions@ajc.org, and questions is plural. I have one final question, though, for each of you. One thing that seems particularly dangerous to me is the ideological purity tests that exist on both sides of the political spectrum. Now, I gather from your answers already that you guys would say that exists in a fairly limited portion of the political spectrum, but still, on the right, we've seen things like the term rhino, or short for Republican in name only, that was popularized, I think, about a decade ago by the Tea Party as a way to attack more moderate Republicans who weren't ready to go whole hog on their revolution. And speaking of revolutions, on the left, you can look to many former supporters or still supporters of Senator Bernie Sanders, who in 2016 argued that there wasn't really a substantive difference between Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump. So you might as well not vote, or vote for Jill Stein, etc. Seth, I assume you've been called a rhino a time or two.
It's happened.
Is this the kind of litmus test? When someone is using this kind of litmus test, is it an intentional tactic to try to assert political control, or are the masses really so caught up in their own ideology that they kind of can't help but adopt this terminology?
There's two parts to this answer. The first is that you hit it on the head when you said that whether or not we agree that these are widely held ideological purity tests, they are held by people who matter, and that's really what matters, right? We have the same debate over free speech on campus. People say, well, only 4% of students in this poll say it's okay to shout down a speaker. But you come back and say, well, but if the school administration is listening to that handful of kids and canceling events because of that handful of kids, it's not about strength in numbers, it's about strength in influence. Same thing with ideological purity tests, and the parties have kind of come apart a bit. They don't have the same control over their messaging and the grassroots, and the whole process has been you would say democratized, but it also looks a bit like anarchy at times. And so that's one thing, is that the people who used to be able to exert that control over stuff are less able to do it. And so influential people just find themselves in a situation where they're able to put these tests up, but they're not the Senate majority leader or somebody. They could be a radio host, or they could be an activist in an organization, and something like that. And so then you have these outsiders coming in and setting these rules. The second part of the answer is that the rhino thing is a dead giveaway, that it is less of an ideological test than it is a party test. Obviously, the ideology is part of it, but when you had, I'll tell you from my perspective on the right, when you had Donald Trump come in, who questioned a lot of the policy orthodoxy of the Republican Party, you're still going to get called a rhino or something else if you fight him hard on that one issue. His supporters will still say, oh, you're I don't know, the fifth columnist or whatever, they'll call you about that being in the movement. But you could be defending tax cuts and free trade, which is what Paul Ryan spent his whole career pushing and stuff like that. You could be defending things like that. But what people get angry about is that they see that the parties, especially because our system gives the president all this power, and each party is led by one person, a nominee and a president, whatever, that they see that person attract so much hate and anger and all these attacks that it becomes a retrenchment of sorts. It becomes, well, whose side are you on? And that has less to do with the ideological fight itself and more to do with the sense that we're a two-party system. The parties are farther apart than they used to be, right? The Rockefeller Republicans are gone and the Blue Dog Democrats are gone. The last prominent pro-life Democrat in Illinois, Dan Lipinski, lost his primary. This is happening to Republicans, in the other direction. And so you say that it's basically a party problem. And so then you have these large nationwide organizations that believe the gulf is wide, and therefore you have to agree with your party, because if you don't, the other side is going to pick the judges, and the judges are going to, the judges are going to rule your religion or your whatever you do out of bounds, and it's going to affect your life because of the amount of influence that the party is going to have once in power.
Yeah. Just before we go to audience Q&A, Batya, I want to give you a chance to answer it. As best I can tell, just being someone who follows you on Twitter and all the flaws of that platform notwithstanding.
I've never been called a rhino.
but as best I can tell, you hold pretty, progressive views on all the right things, from a progressive perspective. You also believe, however, that, as we discussed, that it's important to print more right-wing voices, and you believe that Israel has a right to exist. And that has kind of those things, and maybe a few others, have caused you to run afoul of some ideological purity tests on the left. What do you think about that phenomenon?
Okay, so it would be very easy for me to sort of dunk on like how terrible ideological purity tests on the left are and what they've done to the Jewish community. But instead, I'm gonna just tell you something funny that happened this week, which is that Seth's brilliant wife, Bethany Mandel, tweeted something about the lockdown that a lot of people got extremely obsessed with. And literally it was her words from her tweet were trending, like nationally. And I tweeted, I just don't understand the pleasure people take in being the 1,000th person to dunk on someone, whatever you think of what they said. It just seems so lame. Like, you're obviously the bully at that point, right? Like, whatever happens before, once you're the 1,000th person to dunk on someone, you're the bully. Don't we all hate bullies? Like, isn't that sort of, and the next day, Andy Nago, I think that's how you pronounce his name, from Quillette, tweeted something disparaging about Ahmaud Arbery, who was lynched in Georgia 2 months ago, who, the people who murdered him weren't even arrested until 2 months later because we saw the video. And so this right-wing guy tweeted something disparaging about this victim of lynching. And I literally had already typed my 1,000th person dunking on this terrible person. And I had to stop myself and be like, girl, what are you doing? And it's just so funny, like, which is a funny way of saying, like, we all have ideological purity tests. We all have places that we have drawn a line, and it's spiritual work to be able to say, I'm not going to be the bully. I'm not going to be the person who uses my power or my position or my platform to be the 1,000th person to dunk on somebody, no matter what I think of what they said. It's really spiritual work, because we all have our lines at which we're like, oh no, you did, like, you said that, you're done, you're dead, canceled. It's just that, and I know that what he tweeted about Ahmaud Arbery was terrible and shocking and shameful and horrific. The question is, what do I do with that information? Like, what do I do with those feelings? Where do I go from there? What is America, the body politic and the Twitterverse that unfortunately I'm in? What does it need from me at that point? I think obviously, like, if so Seth and I have flexible, purity lines because that's the work that we're in, and we take it seriously and we're very good at it. But I think that beyond that it really is a spiritual practice to know what to do with those feelings when someone says something that you think is truly beyond the pale.
Mm-hmm. Reminder to our audience that if you have questions to submit, please send them in via email to questions@ajc.org, and questions is plural. With that, I will ask Allie to ask our first audience question.
Yeah, thanks so much. So our first question is from Michael on Zoom. And Seth, if you want to go and answer this question first, that'd be great. As editors, how do you strike a balance between making space for alternative perspectives, but not propagating dangerous points of view or disinformation?
Great question.
Yeah, it's a very good question. It's something we hear a lot in commentary on the media, which is that people say, oh, well, you got to hear both sides. And that, it's one of those things that it used to be a term that people actually meant unironically, and now it's a term that people only mean ironically, right? When you hear someone say you got to hear both sides, it's always making a joke at the expense of whoever published a specific idea. So I think, again, it depends on what kind of publication you are and what your mission is. I think and I think that you have to know the difference between opinion and reporting, right? So you can very easily make something or someone be out of bounds in a political conversation if you say, well, we have to keep dangerous ideas out of it, right? So that's something you do have to do. You do have to keep dangerous ideas out of things, and you do, but you have to wield that power very carefully. You have to be able to say, there's a difference between, I don't know, the anti-vaxxers and the originalist, judicial nominees. Right. And part of the problem that we sometimes have is that everything gets associated with one or the other side. And then that side gets associated with its worst instincts and its worst angels. And then everything starts getting ruled out of bounds. So the key is it depends on the issue, but I think that you have to keep dangerous ideas out very sparingly. And I also think that this is not actually a situation that calls for rules or guidelines. This is actually a it when you see it situation. You don't actually want people, when Twitter tried to figure out how to reduce some of the hate on its network, which is like saying the NFL tried to reduce tackling. It found that the filters couldn't tell the difference between snarky and ironic use of certain things, and it also associated certain terms with certain movements in all cases, when really that's a very new phenomenon. You'll have like the alt-right will come up and they'll take Pepe the Frog or something, right? And then 2 weeks later, everything Pepe is destroyed and you can't use a frog, and then a frog is ruled out of bounds, and this and that. When you have an algorithm doing it, when you have a structure like that doing it, then you can't really you can't discern. What you need is the judgment and common sense of when you see it, that this particular thing is hateful. And if somebody asked you why you kept that out of your publication, you would be able to explain it. You would be able to defend your decision to keep that particular thing on a case-by-case basis out of your publication. And it is a foolhardy mission to try to set standards that automatically rule certain things guilty by association. And instead, you really just have to use your judgment, and you have to trust your judgment, and you have to pay enough attention to things and learn enough about what you're talking about to be able to feel like you have enough of a handle on it to make those calls.
Terrific. Our next question is for you, Batya, and we're getting several questions along similar lines. You were invited to speak at a conference on racism and anti-Semitism at Bard College, where you were faced with protesters from Students for Justice in Palestine. Your session was on anti-Semitism and not on Israel. What did you make of this conflation, and were your views on anti-Semitism or anti-Zionism changed from that interaction?
What I made of it was that it was anti-Semitic. You guys can read my article about it at the foreword. They also made the mistake of not canceling the next panel I was supposed to be on, so I got to actually get on stage and tell everybody what I thought about what had happened, which was that it was anti-Semitic. I'm laughing now, but it was pretty horrifying. And did it change my mind about anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism? I want to come back to what Seth was asked, because it's very relevant. You know, a lot of American Jews consider BDS, the movement to boycott Israel, anti-Semitic. I personally, I'm offended by it, but I don't think it meets the definition of anti-Semitism. So what do I do with that, right? Like, I'm in the minority, you know. I think something like BDS is not anti-Semitic, although it offends me personally. And a lot of Jews think that it is anti-Semitic. Do we run things like that at that point, right? Do I have a right to inflict on my readers content that they might interpret as anti-Semitic based on these questions of legitimacy? And I think, you know, it comes back to what happened at BARD. It was very obviously an anti-Zionist expression that was also anti-Semitic. Like Seth said, you know it when you see it. They came to a panel of 3 Jews and started screaming "Free Palestine" when we were trying to talk about anti-Semitism. Essentially what they did was they held us, although one of them was Israeli, but me and the other panelists, we can't even vote in Israel, right? We're not citizens. So by what connects me to Israel? What makes me responsible for Israel? The fact that I'm a Jew. That's literally the definition of racism. So that to me was very clearly racist and thus anti-Semitic. Whereas something like BDS, again, it offends me personally to see people call for Jews to be boycotted. I think that's gross. But at the same time, there are people I know who support the movement who I know don't have a racist bone in their body. So it really is very tied to this question of journalism and the question of what is a legitimate point of view. You know, we have, you know, a portion of our community is anti-Zionist. We disagree about how to count those numbers. By my tally, it's about 3% of the Jewish community in America is anti-Zionist, doesn't believe Israel should exist. Do they belong in an opinion section? I say yes. I want them reading my section. I want them reading the Israelis that I publish. I want them reading the people making a full-throated defense of Israel. They're part of our community. And so to me, as long as it's not anti-Semitic, there's a seat at the table there. But again, just like Seth said, a lot of it has to do with credibility of individuals, judgment. You know, you could have 2 op-eds and they could be exactly the same and written by 2 different people, and one I would consider legitimate and one not, based on the credibility of the writer. Can they convince me that they're making this anti-Zionist argument in good faith, in a non-anti-Semitic way? You know, that really depends a lot on the author. I hope I answered the question. Can't tell.
That was great, thank you. Our next question comes from David on Zoom. Seth, you spoke a little bit about how the Jewish community treated Jeremy Corbyn, and you said that there was a real democratization of the American Jewish community just because we're so big and so strong. But David wants to know, how can we as Jews in the United States avoid being used as political footballs?
The first thing I would say, it's a very good question. And the first thing I would say is to reduce the amount of things that you consider being used as a political football. I think that these are political issues, and I always find it very funny when people say, oh, don't politicize this. You know, look at these members of Congress politicizing it. Yeah, look at the politicians doing politics. That's what this is. But it's also how a republic, a self-governing republic, operates. So the politicization thing, I would try to avoid falling into that trap. But the other thing is that, and this reflects on something we were talking about earlier on the instrumentalization of anti-Semitism, or the instrumentalization of Israel support and Zionism, is that you have to let people into the debate. And we've seen, you know, I watched my friend Meghan McCain get piled on like crazy once because she stepped in to defend the Jewish community from what she felt was something anti-Semitic. And she got this deluge of hate like, stay out of it. This isn't your fight, and you don't know, and don't tell us what is and isn't anti-Semitism. And there's obviously there is, you know, a truth to that, which is that you shouldn't, you know, goy-splain anti-Semitism to Jews, whatever you want to call it. But you can't ban, you know, people from the conversation, and you can't turn it into an evil thing when people stand up and defend Jews. So I think that we have, and again, it happens on both sides. It's not, you know, it's not a partisan thing. It's just, so I think that there is less true instrumentalization and less true turning into political footballs than a lot of people think, because we've been trained to see all this stuff as don't politicize this or don't politicize that, when what we're talking about is politics. And I think that, you know, we in the Jewish community, when we have to decide something among ourselves, we do, and we should, and we will. But when we're talking about, let's say, anti-Semitism in New York, the mayor is not Jewish. Can the mayor address anti-Semitism? I hope so. I mean, the current mayor is probably best if he doesn't. But, you know, in any other situation, you might say yes. I mean, obviously, these guys should. The police commissioner in New York City is not Jewish. But, you know, the Irish Americans should also speak up, you know, and be part of this conversation. Like, you can't just say, we'll decide what it is and what it isn't, when the response to it and the national reaction to it depends wholly on people who are outside the community. The people making the decisions are outside the community. So we can't just say we'll decide. We don't, you know, despite what others might think and what you might hear, we don't actually control everything, the media and government and entertainment and stuff like that. We don't run the country. And so you have to be able to say, okay, let's have this debate open and honest, and people, you know, you tell people when they step out of line, you tell people, learn about this. I've had people come to me privately and be like, you know, I don't talk about religious issues very much. Like, I don't talk about, this person is not Jewish. I don't talk about Jewish issues. I don't write about Jewish issues, but my job is writing about politics. And I'm wondering if you could tell me how exactly to write about George Soros without being deemed David Duke, right? It can get really complicated. And, you know, we have to, instead of making such people afraid of even participating in the conversation, we just have to be able to say, like, look, here's how we see it, here's how the community sees it, and whatever. But we shouldn't consider that politicization and instrumentalization. We should say we are equal citizens. We are taking part in the political process with everyone else. And when it's a debate, when it's a political debate and a national debate, we will participate. But we're not going to sit up there with a gavel and, you know, and shut everybody else down. We're going to participate, and everybody else has a right to do it as well. And I think that will benefit the debate a lot, because we can talk about the issue at hand. Instead of saying so-and-so is politicizing support for Israel, we can say, well, yeah, the president of the United States runs American foreign policy, and Israel is American foreign policy. So he's going to be part of this. Let's talk about the issue. Let's talk about whether he's right or wrong, instead of saying, I think it's a cop-out most of the time to say that something is being politicized. And I think that it's also a cycle, because one side does it, then the other side does it, that, you know, you got shouted down for saying you were politicizing this subject, and then they come in and do the same thing. And really at heart, you know, it's not politicizing, but it's like, well, you know, you made the rules, so according to your rules, you can't have an opinion on this, and you're a man, so you can't have an opinion on abortion, and you don't own a gun, so you can't have an opinion on guns, and, you know, stuff like that. And like, that's not really how a society can work. So I would say the instrumentalization and political football stuff is very often a distraction, and recognize it for what it is, and try to stay focused on the issue at hand, and not policing the participants of the debate quite as much.
Right. We have one more question, and Batya, I'll go to you first, but then Seth, if you could answer as well, and then I'll hand it back to you, Sefi. You both spoke about political and media elites being very polarized. Sorry, this question is from Gigi from Miami. You spoke about political and media elites being very polarized. What do you think could ultimately break this trend?
Wow, Gigi, that's a really good question. I think we all desperately want to see that. Wow. I think Jews are playing a big role in maintaining a bridge between left and right, which is difficult at this time, but because our community is split down the middle and yet we are not as much as we should be, but still unwilling to relinquish the ties that bind us to other Jews, you will still find Shabbat meals where you have people from both sides, you know, sitting there debating the issues. Obviously, the president is a deeply polarizing figure. He kind of really benefits from polarization, as does the media. That's why they're kind of locked in this battle, because it sort of benefits both of them so well. So in a sense, those elites right now do seem to me very committed to the way that things are. I also think that there's a big kind of anti-populist feel. Elites really feel the need to distinguish themselves from the people who are not elite, and you see this a lot in sort of coverage of economics, where, you know, the media has completely missed the fact that there's a new Republican wing that's taking up economic policies that Republicans like Seth probably think are deeply disastrous because they're so populist and much closer to things that Bernie Sanders was pushing. And so there is a way in which, hidden from view, some of these large issues are much less polarized than we think. But to your question, what will stop the polarization in the elites? I don't have an answer, Gigi. Seth?
I'm really glad that Batya went first on that one, and would like to invite her in all future questions to go first. Yeah, look, one brief answer and then a longer answer. The first one is, yesterday somebody tweeted a poll of how Republicans think about lockdown stuff now, about the specific things of, you know, I think the question was, are you worried about, so it's how concerned are you about someone?
You print that tweet?
What?
You printed that tweet?
I did, yeah. I worked really hard in getting we just moved, and I spent a while connecting my printer and finding the WPS button, which is not labeled on the brand new Verizon access points, by the way. And so if anybody out there, there's a button on the front. Well, we can do that later. But anyway, you know, so the question is, how concerned are you about someone in your family becoming seriously ill from the coronavirus outbreak? The Monmouth poll: Democrats, 60% very concerned. 40% less concerned. Republicans, 25% very concerned, 73% less concerned. So that sounds like a really big divide. But then the journalist Erica Greeter wrote, this is a bit less jarring when you remember there's a correlation between the density of your community and its partisan balance. So my first answer is in what the public can do. What the public should do is read things like this and ask yourself the question, is there another explanation? And there usually is. There's often a population density, you know, example. I mean, people ask you, why are Jews liberal? And one of the most accurate answers is because Jews are liberals, right? Jews live in cities where very, very blue cities where most people are Democrats, and you know, look where Jews live. Look at the power structure around them. Look at the history of the politics around them. They look like anybody else. They vote like the people around them, and you know, they fit in quite nicely. And it just don't happen to be large numbers of Jews in Alabama and places, you know, elsewhere that match, you know, the sort of. So one thing I would do is sometimes we overanalyze things, and sometimes we underanalyze them. we should always look for another explanation. There usually is. There's where you live, and there's all sorts of other variables, right? And pollsters, when they poll things, they try to weight answers based on, the respondents do not really reflect the population, and so they weight certain categories of respondents so that they can just try to even things out. You should do that in your mind. The second thing is that, and I think Batya touched on this, which is, this is going to sound like some kind of supply side economics application to it, but the truth is that you have to change the incentive structure. Incentive structures rule free societies. That's how it works. So if you have a choice to make, and the government or some power structure can influence that choice the way it does, it's going to choose to do so. So in the media, there's an incentive structure to find conflict, and if it bleeds, it leads has always been what they said about the media. But we also have to be more careful about the kind of petty fights that we see between people in the media, between the media and politicians. I watch I can't even really watch the daily briefings anymore, because it looks like airing private laundry. It looks like, the president and the some journalists that he's known for a while. It looks like a conversation they should be having at a bar or something, privately, work it out, and then come here and ask, questions about the coronavirus, please. But, the things tend to spiral into very, very personal and dramatic stories, because that's, what people are reading or think they're reading or whatever. And so the incentive structure is always the way to change things, is always the way to change behavior. And until you do something about that, there's politicians who, let's say a politician comes from a district where it's completely safe. Their incentive structure is to listen to their base, and to listen to maybe the more extreme elements of the base, because their race that matters is the primary. And in a different district where you have to rely on votes coming from the other side, the real race is the general election, and you'll craft your message accordingly. And that's the incentive structure. And so you have to address what it makes sense for people to do, and what are people being rewarded for. If they're being rewarded for this behavior, the behavior will continue.
So we are nearly at the hour. Let me just personally say thank you, Batya, thank you, Seth, and thank you to the hundreds of people who have tuned in. Ali, would you like to bring us to a close?
Sure, thanks. Thank you for that fascinating discussion, and thanks to our partners at Jewish Insider. I also want to thank our audience for joining us in these unique times. While so many of us are separated from our family and friends, AJC is still bringing us together on the issues that matter. Please consider making a donation to AJC so we can offer you more programs like this one, and so we can continue fighting hate and anti-Semitism and working to keep our community safe. Visit ajc.org/donate. Our next Advocacy Anywhere program will be Thursday, May 14th at noon Eastern. We'll be hearing from former member of Knesset, Einat Wolf, about her new book. Please stay safe and healthy, everyone.